They showed up with clipboards, fake patches, and threats, convinced they could scare a man into giving up his house. What they didn't know was that 6 Navy SEALs were already on their way to his driveway. The knock on Calvin Dunmore's darter came sharp and heavy, 3 blows that weren't neighborly. It was just past 6 in Concord, North Carolina, when most people were winding down, stoves simmering, TVs flickering. Calvin dried his hands and opened the door to find 2 men in tactical vests, bold white letters reading HOA Enforcement Division, radios clipped to silent belts, clipboards tight in their hands. One had a scar above his brow, the other hid behind mirrored shades. "You've been found in violation," the tall one said flatly, "and you have 48 hours to vacate this property." Calvin almost laughed. He owned the place, mortgage paid off years ago, and the HOA president himself had shaken his hand at last month's meeting. Still, these men leaned closer, threatening escalation. Their patches looked like cheap printouts, their paperwork bare of signatures, their radios switched off. He folded his arms and asked them for names, codes, board members. Their irritation showed. "Most people don't argue," the shorter one snapped. But Calvin wasn't most people. He told them to get off his property. They smirked, daring him to call the police. They thought fear was leverage. But Calvin wasn't scared. He was angry. The SUV lingered outside, their silhouettes visible behind tinted glass, one tapping on a tablet, watching him through the blinds. Calvin stepped back onto his porch and called them out in a voice loud enough for the street. The tall one returned, slow and heavy, tossing vague lines about rules. The short one thrust a fake eviction notice into Calvin's hand. The paper was laughable, typed with blank lines. No seals, no weight. Calvin waved it back at them and told them it wasn't worth the printer ink. They didn't need him to believe, they said, only to leave. He told them flatly they'd chosen the wrong door. They lowered their voices to threats, promising a hard way if he didn't comply. Calvin warned them once more. 1 foot on his porch and they'd regret it. The impostors sneered, asking if he'd call the cops. He smiled faintly and said he wouldn't need the cops. And that's when headlights appeared at the end of the street. 3 vehicles, rolling slow, steady, engines humming low. The impostors didn't notice at first, but Calvin did. He knew, those cars knew the men stepping out before the doors even closed. 6 figures, shoulders broad, presence undeniable. The kind of stance you don't mistake. Jonas Redden with streaks of gray in his beard, Marcus and Vale Lockhart, Damian Crowell, Silas Trent, Vaughn Kessler, brothers from another life, all former Navy SEALs, all cut from the same steel. They lined the driveway like a wall, their eyes sharp and voices steady. Jonas asked what was happening. Calvin gestured at the 2 pretenders and told them the claim, that the HOA had sent them to evict him. Pierce barked a laugh. Silas studied the patches, noting the stitching too clean, too new. Damian pressed them for codes and statutes. Vaughn called out the bluff, shaking his head at the sheer boldness. The impostors wavered. They tried to hold their line, tossing out words like official business, but Jonas plucked the notice, held it up, and mocked its emptiness. Neighbors peeked from windows, porches filling with silent eyes. The impostors realized their script wasn't working anymore. Calvin stepped forward again, saying he'd worked too hard for this home. His kids had grown here, and no cheap scare tactic was going to change that. The impostors' confidence cracked. One stammered that interfering with official duties was a crime. Vaughn laughed and told him the only crime here was impersonating law enforcement. Their bluffs unraveled in front of an audience too large to ignore. Jonas stuffed the fake paper into the impostor's vest and gave them 2 options. Leave in their SUV right now, or stay and let the police come. The impostors muttered, their shoulders shifting, their eyes darting as if calculating their odds. But before they could choose, another engine rumbled onto the block. A pickup truck pulled up behind the row of cars. Out stepped Dean Morrick, late to the reunion, bigger than all of them, calm and steady as he shut his door. He scanned the scene the way trained men do, angles, exits, threats cataloged in seconds. "Some party you've got going, Cal," he said dryly. Calvin exhaled, tension easing just a little. Jonas pointed toward the impostors and said flatly, "They claim they're HOA cops." Dean raised a brow, almost amused. "HOA cops? That's a new one." The laughter rolling. Through the group broke the last bit of swagger the impostors had. The tall one tried again, insisting Calvin was out of compliance. Dean stopped him cold. "That vest is stitched wrong, the radio's off, and the patch looks like it came off eBay. You're faking it." The impostor's words dried up under that certainty. Marcus stepped forward, his voice low and cutting, asking what their real game was. Were they running a scam, picking houses, hoping fear would empty them out? The short one snapped, but the comeback was hollow. Silas told them plainly they'd made a mistake. They thought they'd find a man alone, someone easy to push around. Instead, they found a man with 6 brothers who didn't back down. The air was charged now. The street hushed under the weight of the standoff. Neighbors whispered at the edges. The impostors knew the truth. They weren't in control anymore, and standing in front of them was a line of men who had stared down far, worse than 2 con artists in fake tactical vests. Pretending to be something you're not always comes with a cost, because eventually someone who knows the real thing shows up. That was the truth Calvin's uninvited visitors were about to learn. The 2 men who came striding up his walkway, dressed in cheap vests and heavy boots, carried themselves with authority that felt rehearsed rather than earned. The shorter one snapped that they didn't answer to anyone and were there on business. But Silas Trent, standing at Calvin's side, tilted his head and asked with quiet sharpness what kind of business involved running a shakedown in broad daylight. He warned them they had chosen the wrong house. This wasn't a scared retiree or single parent they could push out. Calvin had friends. Friends who would not let him stand alone. Calvin stepped up beside Silas, his anger steady but controlled. He made it clear he wasn't leaving, and neither were the men around him. If the visitors had any real reason for being there, now was the time to state it. Their silence was louder than excuses. The tall one clenched his jaw, but his script had already unraveled. Dean, calm as always, laid out exactly what was happening. Intimidation, disguised as authority. A scam, built on fear. It might have worked elsewhere, but today they had stumbled across a man who didn't scare easily. Worse, they had walked in on the same day 6 Navy SEALs were gathered for a reunion. Murmurs spread among the neighbors, phones lifted to capture every moment, and the so-called hunters realized they had become prey in front of an audience. The tall imposter tried to regain control, barking that they were interfering with federal business, but Jonas laughed openly, pointing out the absurdity. HOA disputes were not federal, and neither were these men. The only reason they were still standing on that porch was because the veterans were giving them the choice to walk away. The shorter one twitched his hand toward his vest, but Vaughn's booming command froze him mid-motion. Slowly, he lowered his arm, realizing just how badly outmatched he was. Around them, the street had turned into a stage, neighbors watching, children peeking from windows, a growing crowd with cameras raised high. The impostors exchanged a desperate glance, muttering about coming back later, but Dean cut them off. If they returned, it wouldn't just be neighbors recording them. The police would be waiting, and every second of this footage would end up in the right hands. Jonas pressed the point further. If they were legitimate, they should have identification. The tall one sneered that they didn't need to prove anything, but Jonas shot back that refusal already proved the truth. Pierce, sharp-tongued as ever, added that they had made one fatal mistake. They assumed intimidation was enough without ever checking who they were really dealing with. Damien pressed harder, demanding the name of their supposed authority. There was nothing but shifting feet and silence. Vaughn's deep laugh made it sting worse. Their script was in tatters, their bluff exposed. The crowd swelled, phones capturing every second, and what began as a private scare tactic had turned into a public humiliation. Silas asked the simple question no one else had. What exactly was the end game? Scare a man out of his home, then what, loot it? Squat in it? It was sloppy and poorly thought out. Calvin stepped forward, his voice rising with conviction. They had looked at him and assumed weakness, but they didn't know him at all. The taller imposter snapped back, insisting, They didn't know who they were dealing with, but Jonas closed the distance until his shadow fell over the man. Calm, steady, and dangerous, he made it clear they had no idea who they were standing in front of. Every man there had faced worse than this pair could imagine. They didn't scare anyone. When the shorter one tried to brandish paperwork, Pierce snatched it away, flipping through pages that turned out to be nothing more than a free online eviction template, still in default font. His laughter carried across the lawn as he ripped it in half and tossed it aside. The crowd chuckled, the impostors shrinking further as Damien folded his arms and gave them one option: leave. But pride still clung to them. The tall one squared, his shoulders insisting they answered to someone higher. Jonas shut him down again, stating that real authority carried itself differently, and these two didn't have it. The shorter one stepped closer to Calvin, threatening that this wasn't over. Vaughn's voice thundered in response that their only mistake had been picking the one street guarded by 7 SEALs. More neighbors arrived, more phones lifted, and the impostors realized they weren't facing just a handful of men anymore. They were staring at an entire community. Calvin called them out directly, warning that every second they lingered meant more witnesses and more evidence. Dean finally spoke again, calm as ever, reminding them impersonating authority was a crime that would stick, and now it was captured on dozens of recordings. That truth rattled them more than anything. Their scam thrived in shadows, not under daylight scrutiny. Still, the tall one made one last attempt at control, pointing at Calvin and swearing they'd return. Silas cut him down with a razor-sharp promise. If they did, the police would already have their names, faces, and license plate. Jonas stepped closer, warning that holding out didn't make them look tough, only desperate, and desperate men always made mistakes. The standoff stretched, the neighborhood holding its breath, until finally the tall imposter spat at the ground and turned toward the SUV. His partner followed, head low, and the crowd broke into quiet cheers. Calvin exhaled, but Jonas warned him not to relax. Men like that hated losing and always tried to claw back. The SUV's engine rumbled, but the impostors lingered, unwilling to let go of their pride. Even as Silas pulled out his phone and began recording up close, asking for their supervisor's name, the fraud stayed silent. Calvin twisted the knife, offering to call the real HOA president on speaker so she could confirm she'd never heard of them. That broke the last of their confidence. The shorter one snapped, jumping out to threaten Vaughn, but Jonas stepped between them, towering and unyielding, telling him to put his finger down. The imposter wilted under the weight of so many cameras, so many witnesses, and Calvin seized the moment to declare for everyone present that these men had come to his door pretending to be HOA enforcement, threatening eviction, when in truth, they were nothing but scammers. The crowd gasped, phones zoomed closer, and their scheme collapsed in real time. Pierce ended it with a clap and a sharp command to get in their SUV and vanish before the real police arrived. The tall one muttered about regret, but Silas smirked that the only regret would be theirs. Dean stepped closer, his voice too calm to ignore, and told them this was their last chance. Next time, squad cars would be waiting. Finally, the imposters slammed their doors, the SUV jerking away from the curb as neighbors erupted into conversation. Calvin let out the breath he'd been holding, but Jonas leaned close, reminding him the fight wasn't over. Scams like this didn't vanish in one night. They would be back, or others like them would, which meant the next step was clear. It was time to get the police involved. The night had barely settled when Calvin pulled out his phone, intent on calling the police himself. But before he could press dial, the wail of sirens rolled in from the distance, echoing through the neighborhood. Blue and red lights painted the block as 2 patrol cars roared onto the scene, cutting off the imposter's SUV at the stop sign. Tires screeched, doors slammed open, and real officers poured out with commands that silenced every sound but their voices. "Vehicle off! Hands where we can see them!" The imposter's false bravado crumbled instantly. The tall one raised, his hand stiffly, while the shorter one muttered curses under his breath until another sharp order forced him to fall in line. Neighbors crowded onto porches, cameras high, children peering from windows. The impostors who had strutted with false authority now looked stripped bare in the floodlights. Jonas leaned toward Calvin, murmuring just loud enough to be heard, "Now we'll see just how official they really are." The senior officer, Sergeant Willis, broad-shouldered and steady, swept his flashlight across the impostors' SUV, pulling out flimsy props that wouldn't fool a rookie. "Not even police grade," he muttered to his partner, who shook his head and held up a vest. "Bought this online. Stitching's all wrong. Cheap costume." The shorter imposter tried to argue. "We're HOA enforcement. This is just a misunderstanding." But Willis's raised brow cut him down. "HOA enforcement? That's not a thing. And even if it was, you wouldn't be showing up in tactical gear, making threats." Calvin stepped forward, his voice firm, carrying over the gathering crowd. "They told me I had 48 hours to leave my house. They gave me fake papers and said they'd handle it their way if I didn't comply." The murmurs turned into a wave of outrage. Phones zoomed in closer, catching every word. The younger officer cuffed the tall one, speaking crisply about impersonating authority and intimidation. "That's a felony. That's real time." The imposter stiffened but didn't resist. His partner squirmed, glaring at Calvin. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." Calvin didn't flinch. "The only thing I'd regret is if you ever come back." The crowd's energy shifted, anger giving way to relief, a sense that justice was unfolding right there under the streetlights. Jonas leaned close again. "This is what daylight looks like. No shadows for them to hide in." By morning, word had spread faster than the sirens had traveled. Clips from the confrontation filled Facebook feeds. A local news headline read, "Men posing as HOA enforcers arrested after confrontation." Calvin sat on his porch with a mug of coffee as cars slowed, drivers glancing or nodding at him like he was a symbol of something bigger. He didn't feel like a hero. He told Jonas exactly that. "I just didn't want to be bullied out of my own home." But Jonas reminded him why it mattered. They counted on fear doing the heavy lifting. You showed them what happens when fear doesn't get its way. At the community meeting later that day, the HOA president, Patricia Landon, stood at the podium, her voice steady. "Let me be clear. The HOA does not and will never enforce anything through intimidation or unannounced visits. What happened was a scam, and thanks to Calvin and his neighbors, it's been exposed." The room erupted in applause. Residents shared stories of scam calls, phony letters, strangers knocking with excuses. It became clear the imposters weren't just an isolated incident. They were part of a wider pattern, and now the community had seen how to break it. Dean Morick answered when someone asked how the group of veterans knew what to do. "It wasn't about being vets. It was about standing up for each other. You don't need training to see through a lie. You just need courage and sometimes backup." That one line echoed through neighborhood forums and inspired talk of a community watch. Not police, but a web of support to ensure no one faced something like this alone. Later that week, Sergeant Willis called Calvin with an update. The imposters were facing charges: impersonating law enforcement, attempted fraud, trespassing. Calvin felt relief, but also a sober gratitude. His father's old lessons rang in his ears. Stand your ground, tell the truth, never let fear write your story. That evening, the friends finally gathered for their postponed cookout. The grill smoked, laughter rose, and the weight of the week eased. Pierce raised a bottle. "Here's to being in the right place at the right time." Dean added, "And here's to Cal, who was already standing tall before we got here. We just made the picture bigger." As the night wore down, Calvin sat by the fire, listening to the crackle and his friends' easy banter. He realized his house wasn't just walls and siding. It was a symbol of his work, his life, and now his community's strength. The imposters had tried to reduce it to a target. Instead, it had become a rallying point. He lifted his voice, clear and steady. "We don't get to pick when trouble shows up, but we do get to choose whether we face it alone or together. And together, we can handle anything." The fire dimmed. Laughter broke out over a joke about burnt hot dogs, and the heaviness of fear lifted into something lasting, unity. Calvin knew the fear of that knock would never fully vanish. But neither would the memory of neighbors and friends standing, shoulder to shoulder. That balance, fear and unity, was what he would carry forward. The lesson was simple. Authority isn't in a vest or badge, it's in truth, in community, in refusing to let lies win. And when people stand together, no scam, no bully, no imposter can take that away.